Hi, I'm Kathleen Sabo of New Mexico Ethics Watch, and this is Ethics Now, conversation about ethics in everyday life. Our guest today is Trip Jennings. He's the Executive Director of New Mexico In-Depth. New Mexico In-Depth's stated goal is to tell in-depth stories of people who represent our diversity and to challenge power in a way that informs and empowers people and communities. You can reach the publication at nmindepth.com. Welcome, Trip. Thanks for joining me here on this podcast.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. Yes, I'm looking forward to this.
Well, and I just want to ask before we get into things, how are you and your family doing? Everyone's safe and healthy? And
Yeah. I mean, everyone is doing well. We're staying safe. We're donning our masks when we go out. I have been working at home for most of the last 12 years, so this is somewhat interesting for me. My wife is adapting. She worked out of the home, so she's having to work at home more often. But everyone is doing well. I hope so with you as well.
yes, absolutely. Yes, thank you. Realizing the import of the situation and
Yeah.
acting accordingly, at
Right.
least according to how we feel. So
Right.
that's what I'll say. So we've heard a tiny little bit about New Mexico In-Depth, but you have a rich history that precedes New Mexico In-Depth. So just to give people sort of a fuller picture of who you are as a journalist, can you just talk about your background a little bit, please?
Yeah, I was born and raised in the town that gave the world James Brown, Augusta, Georgia, and as well as Jesse Norman, if you're an opera fan.
Mm-hmm.
But I started my career in newspapers at my hometown newspaper, Augusta Chronicle, and starting in the 80s, that dates me, and then moved around the country. Worked in California at a newspaper, worked in Florida, worked in Connecticut, and then moved here in 2005 to work for the Albuquerque Journal, covering Governor Richardson and the legislature. And during that time in newspapers, I will say that my experience in Connecticut, most it resonates the most right now because we were there when 9/11 happened and anthrax. So I had to cover both events, and so I got a schooling in epidemiology and public health back in 2001. So my career in newspapers was very varied. Covered that kind of stuff, but also political corruption. The governor went to federal prison
Mm-hmm.
and things like that. And then 8 years ago, we started New Mexico In-Depth, which is digital first.
Well, so tell me, was it a necessity to start New Mexico In-Depth? Had the newspaper business changed so much that you needed to find another avenue? Or did you see some kind of potential online or with a different way of covering the news?
Well, I think, it became obvious in 2000, prior to starting New Mexico In-Depth. I was part of a team in 2008 that started New Mexico's first internet newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
I left the Journal to start New Mexico Independent. So New Mexico In-Depth is somewhat an extension, and I guess of that. What I want to say is it became evident in the mid to late 2000s, a decade ago, that the internet at some point was going to become the dominant way that people consumed their news
Mm-hmm.
and information. Beyond news, information, entertainment, all this kind of stuff. And so I think I left a stable job, a really good job, actually, at the Journal. It was fun covering Governor Bill Richardson,
I'll bet.
honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just fantastic. We continued to cover him at New Mexico Independent, but it was somewhat different. So I, for the past 12 years, have been mostly a digital, citizen. I guess is that what they call them? Although our news does go into newspapers. I mean, newspapers do reprint our stories. But I think, I don't know what your experience is, Kathleen, but I know my experience has been over the last decade. I used to get the Sunday New York Times in paper form. Now I read it online.
Mm-hmm.
Now I have access to the Washington Post, which I've never had access to in paper form. And so now I read it online. And so in some ways, I feel much more informed because I actually go to these sources.
No, same thing. Same thing with me. Subscriptions to both those national papers,
Yeah,
and used to love. Grew up holding the New York Times. Went to
yeah.
school in New York City. I learned probably more out of the New York Times every day than I learned at college. Just reading everything. Just reading.
Exactly.
And so that was that was just a comfort zone. But now
Yeah.
online is great.
Right.
And
Right.
so I'm with you. So now you said online first for New Mexico in depth. So does that, you don't have a standalone paper then that people can?
No,
Okay.
no, we don't. But what
Okay.
happens is somebody like the Las Cruces Sun News will want to print one of our stories, or the Santa Fe New Mexican, or someone like that. The Gallup Independent prints some of our stories. So you will see some of our stories in the actual newspapers. We do once a year put out a 40-page special edition prior to each legislative session. That's the one print product that we do put out, and it runs in 9 newspapers around the state. 2 days before the opening of the session, we usually kind of do deep dives into the issues
Okay.
that the lawmakers will deal with each session.
So just to remind folks, if they want to read you before you get into any other newspapers, it's nmindepth.com. Okay.
Correct.
So today we're here to talk about ethical journalism, ethics in journalism, however you want to phrase it. And, even if someone just does a quick search on the internet, what they come up with is a code of ethics by the Society of Professional Journalists. Is that no, I'm an attorney, so I'm governed by an ethical code, and I actually have to take courses each year. I'm mandatory in ethics. Is that similar with journalists, or how does it work with that code of ethics, please?
I can go. In some ways, journalism is not governed by like the bar. So in some ways, it is it is a profession in the sense that it is, whatever you consider like white collar workers or whatever, but it does not. It like attorneys have the code. If they violate it, it can be punished, as I understand
Absolutely.
it. And so there is not the same sort of governing body for journalism. And so the SBJ Code of Ethics is something that's one. Poynter Institute in Florida, which is a think tank, will actually put out a book, and they update it every several years. I can't say how many journalists, read this, but I imagine in my world, a lot of people read the SBJ Code of Ethics, or they're familiar with Poynter. In the last 20 years, I say that with also the proviso that in the last 20 years, journalism has changed dramatically from being, was it 20 years? Yeah, probably 20 years, maybe 25, where you had local newspapers, you had 3 or 4 local TV stations, you had PBS and the networks, and there was a kind of small world. And in the last 25 years, it has just exploded. And there's all sorts of types of journalists, by which I mean, do I, as somebody who's come out of newspaper reporting, and this is more about reporting stories,
right?
Do I think that someone on a cable news network, I don't care what ideological side they're on, do I think a talking head is the same kind of journal, same as I am? No. That's just me, because I came out of a certain tradition. And so they're sort of similar to maybe, opinion writers in a newspaper.
No, I get it. No, I get it. And what it says to me is that consumers of news journalism need to do a background check sort of on the sources that they are accessing.
Absolutely.
The standards that they try to uphold or not.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the greatest, if we're here to talk about ethical journalism and just honestly ethical consumption of news, I think being a critical thinker, and that's what you mean, like, okay, let's check the website. Let's check to see if they're transparent about who they're funded by. Let's check to see,
Yeah.
if they link to reports. Is it just opinion without any like corroboration or, backup documents? That's always something. And I don't, for me, I have read stuff out of the Wall Street Journal, which has a conservative editorial page, and the New York Times, which has a different editorial page. And frankly, to be honest with you, I trust both of them because they've been around for a long time. And so I trust the methodology they use. The
And yes, and in fact, their ethics, their journalistic ethics.
That's correct. That's
what you trust. Now, I did tell you ahead of time that I'd be talking, or at least mentioning, or referring to codes of ethics by SBJ and others. And you said, "Oh, let me refamiliarize myself." And I said, "It's probably second nature to you." And that's in fact what you found when you looked at it, isn't it?
Yes. And I mean, when I say refamiliarize, I just want to make sure that I had not missed any updated stuff I put in the last update.
I get it.
But it sounds exactly, most of it, like the mentoring and education I got at my first newspaper in the 80s in Georgia. A lot of it was, independence. Go, if somebody says something about someone, go to this other person and check with them, get their response. So in many ways, it is like second nature. When I read it, I was like, oh yeah, this is like old newspaper journalism.
Yeah, and there are 4 principles. I'll just mention these. And you know what we're going to do? We're going to have a link to codes as resources by the program description so people can take a look at it. But just to like sort of really quickly summarize 4 principles for the SBJ's code. Number 1, seek truth and report it. Number 2, minimize harm. Number 3, act independently. And number 4, be accountable and transparent. And just even hearing those, I hope makes some consumers of journalism feel better, knowing that people, journalists are following this or familiar with it. And then again, having to make that decision about whether they're actually following these codes or not.
That last part, I'm going to say something about minimizing harm.
Yeah.
Which is, this is something that I had to grow into understanding, because when you are 20 something, you have perhaps a different feel for the world than you do when you're my age, which is a little older and maybe tenderized by life. But minimizing harm, realizing that if you're talking to a public official, they can be held to a certain standard of accountability, because they should be very aware of who they're talking to, and if they say something, it's probably going to be in the story. If I talk to somebody who's never been interviewed by a journalist, we actually have had these kind of conversations at New Mexico in Depth. Do we want to make sure that they understand? We check with them again. Do you understand that this is going to be in a story? Because we don't want to harm somebody's life if they don't realize that they may be in a story that could wind up on the front page of a newspaper in their hometown. And so, there's all these sorts of things and they can be bright line tests, but sometimes it's situation by situation.
Yeah, have a nuance to it. And, this goes hand in hand. One of the other things in the code under the seek truth and report it is, seeking out voices that aren't heard normally. So of course you're going to run into those situations where someone won't have the understanding.
Right. I mean, and that is part of our mission. I mean, we often report from the perspective of underserved communities. And when I say underserved, people who aren't necessarily served by some of the media outlets that have been around for a long time.
Right.
And so that is something, that's why we have these conversations internally, because my background has been, in the last 20 years, been speaking to governors and lawmakers. So I've had to readjust and kind of like pivot to understand that, I'm talking to maybe a mother in maybe a native community who's never spoken to the media before. And there's a different sort of analysis on how, just to make sure that they're represented correctly, because they're, and carefully.
Okay, so with this conversation as a background, let's talk about what are some of the ethical issues you and your reporters on your staff are facing during this pandemic?
So there really are so many. I wish that we had 3 or 4 hours so we could unpack them all, but we don't. I'm joking. But one thing is that in New Mexico in Depth, we really try to focus on documents and data, because we want to make sure that we can be accurate and that we can be as precise as possible when we're doing a story, because often our stories sort of are targeted to people in power making decisions about a lot of people. And so in the middle of COVID-19, as we are covering, we pivoted much of our time over 8 years of our existence. We've taken a lot of time for stories, weeks, sometimes months.
Right.
March 11th, we totally pivoted to cover COVID-19. So in the space of 2 months, we probably have produced more than 60 stories, which is it's a different kind of pace. And that forces us to constantly think about how to report about the virus and how it affects communities, with the recognition, you and I were just talking about this before the call, that the science on the virus is going to be changing, because the scientific method is not static, and scientists and researchers and political health experts are going to be learning new things about this at the same time that this is not taking place in some sterile atmosphere in a petri, like some lab. This is happening in real time, and it is in the middle of an amazing political conversation about when to reopen, when not to reopen, what do you there's part of the population that is really being ravaged by this. Should everybody else be under lockdown because just part of the population? Those are questions out there that we sometimes have to report on.
So do you then tend to stick to just saying, here's what this official says, or here's what this scientist has to say, or what's the ethical thing to do there, to let people know that this could change or that it has changed?
We try to present that reality, that the science can change. I think with our entity, with our organization, we have always been sort of, it's that truth to power thing. We hold people in power accountable. So we have kept up with that. I'll give you an example. When Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham, who's received a lot of praise in the national press, and she locked down early. Part of that is probably her background, right? Public health.
Yeah.
I think she understands this in a way that some maybe other officials don't. But our organization, thanks to Jeff Proctor, really kind of held her accountable on not doing any testing in the prisons.
Well, and that was an area I wanted to get into, Trip, because in just perusing your site, I see that you've done a number of stories on the prison population. And actually our episode last week, we had 3 people from the ACLU, from the Law Office of the Public Defender, talking about the ethics of keeping people in prisons and jails. And I saw that your organization were some of the first people, if not the first, to start, reporting on the lack of testing. And then eventually the testing occurred.
And yes, it did. And part of that, you can see that arising out of our mission, as I said, underserved communities. a lot of people don't really report on prison populations.
Right.
And oftentimes they are forgotten, a forgotten population. I think there's also, with some people, there may be a stigma around people who are in prison. And we can have a different discussion about, responsibility and what comes with that, and actions and all that kind of stuff. But our ethics as an organization is everybody is human being, and so we need to think about this population. We did some really early reporting around Native Americans too, because
Mm-hmm.
that was not necessarily in the press in a way that it was apparent to those of us who have been around infectious diseases and know public health, from our experience in reporting, that that there are certain populations that were going to get hit harder than other populations, um, and that has turned out to be the case. I and part of that, I think everyone on our staff is sensitive to that. I can tell you from my personally, I didn't grow up in New Mexico. I grew up in Georgia, and I became very aware that certain populations didn't have all the benefits of society as perhaps maybe others. And it's a very complicated conversation. But you will see that the African American population in Georgia is getting hit extraordinarily much harder than the white population.
Yeah.
And so there are some similarities to New Mexico.
Well, and you sent me a an article that we'll post as a resource with the show description, really sort of addressing sort of ethically how to address the issues that are arising in underserved populations. And
Yeah,
what are the ethical sort of questions for you or concerns for you that come up with that?
I think that we as an organization have to be more mindful of this. I think all news organizations have to be mindful of this, but I can only speak for ours. I think we've done an okay job. I think we can do better. But when we write about communities that are being hit harder, you have the people who wrote that essay for the New England Journal of Medicine, which is a highly regarded periodical. They're right. You have to place this stuff in historical and policy kind of history. There's a great deal of history that is behind why these communities are being affected: policies, laws, economics. And sometimes that's hard. I know on my Facebook page, as a journalist who is engaging, I often have conversations about redlining or the GI Bill and how it affected non-whites and stuff. Sometimes it's hard to put all that stuff into a story, or about the Dawes Act, 1877, which created certain inequities in reservations.
But if you don't sort of at least remind people of that historical context, don't you run the risk of reinforcing stereotypes or creating ill will or ill regard for population?
Yeah, and in particular, the authors said that, and this is something that I'm very mindful of. It leaves a vacuum, so people who don't know, and I've actually heard these questions from friends back in Georgia, when I posted stories about Native Americans, and COVID-19. Well, it just makes me think that their behavior is, they must be doing something behavior-wise that is leading to this. And I'm like, no, there's a lot of things, and I'd have to go in and explain. Or, well, are they biologically predisposed to this stuff?
Yeah.
No, that's like, I try to be, this is tricky stuff, right? So I try to be like, no, you're kind of hewing to an old understanding of how race and biology go together, that's been just totally obliterated by science.
Right.
And so this is something we're thinking about. Yeah.
Yeah, understandably, and thank you for thinking about it. So, what other? Actually, let me jump to this, and this is something we talked about ahead of time too. Uh, is it ethical for journalists to strive to be agents of change? Is it ethical for journalists to be simply stenographers? Is there some middle ground? And these are all things that we're seeing
Mm.
discussed, obviously, in public discourse about journalists. So I just wanted to get your thoughts about that, please.
So on stenographers, no, we're definitely not there just to record the words of people.
Okay.
Um, that's just where I come down. As far as agents of change, that is a phrase that I sort of shy away from. But I will say that if you have a certain worldview about what journalism does, what you think journalism is, and this is where, like, with the bar and the legal world, you can have a little more consensus on what the law is about.
Hmm.
And you always have, great, wonderful legal debates. I mean, I like reading some of that stuff sometimes. With journalism, you have people who have all sorts of different understandings of journalism. Some people do actually think that it is stenography. Um, I'm not out of that tradition. I'm that, and part of it was probably becoming a government reporter and being exposed to corruption. I mean, I'll just be honest with you. And it's not Republican, it's not Democrat, it's power. And then becoming very aware of how power acts in the world, and frankly experiencing, I love to read a lot too. I like history. And when you suddenly see a theme, which is oftentimes the people who have the fewest resources and the least access to power are the ones who are most affected by stuff.
Hmm.
And I there's a moral value judgment that I make as a journalist, which is I don't think that's right. You know,
No, I get
and,
it. Yeah, go ahead.
and, and so that, I don't know if that's an agent of change. I think that's more of a kind of uh, an orientation to power and how it is used, and maybe an understanding that we are all human beings.
Well, and knowing the power of what your work can achieve as well.
Right.
And there's a long tradition of exposing the corruption of powerful people, is there not? And that it sounds like you're in that tradition.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, you and I talked about this yesterday. I mean, it's like, really, I think that we like to think of ourselves in the muckraker tradition.
Hmm.
Muckrakers were, Ida Tarbell, uh, almost individually, uh, through her reporting in McClure magazine back in the early 20th century, broke apart Standard Oil. I mean, it was amazing. Upton Sinclair on the meatpacking plants in Chicago, Lincoln Steffens, and one of the greatest muckrakers who just won a Pulitzer Prize posthumously is Ida B. Wells.
Mm.
I mean, African-American woman who took on lynching. I get goosebumps when I think about that kind of stuff. So I say that I want to be humble. We want to be a part of that tradition. We want to live into that. We hope we do. I'm not sure that we always do, but that is one of our kind of guiding principles.
And it seems to me you're able to adhere to a lot of the code,
Yes.
or put it into action by taking
That's
that kind of position. That's just the sense I got when I reread the code.
Yeah, we always talk to, even if we're maybe doing a story on a government decision, we always talk to people on all sides of the issue. Or if it's something about maybe an investigative piece about one person, we talk to that person to get their side of the story, because sometimes they might have a reasoned kind of like defense for this thing.
Yeah. Now we're in this incredible time of change, as we've noted, sometimes from day to day. It's certainly in certain aspects of life. What do you what are your ethics telling you to keep your eye on, or your, even your journalistic senses? What are, and I'm not trying to steal a scoop from you here, or anything, but what are you looking at? Are you still looking at the behaviors and actions of public officials? What is really grabbing you now?
Well, I think that for us, our organization, and for me, it is how I spoke about. Someone said this, and I think this was not original to me. This virus is not just going to like move across the population. It's going to reveal deep inequities in our society. And so that we were talking about that earlier. It's one of these situations where I think that we are. We've done stories on how Native American students are doing school now. There's a cultural. I've heard this for years, but I think it's revealing itself here. A lot of these students are back home. There's a digital divide, which some of these folks live in towns where they don't have high-speed internet. There's also kind of a cultural premium being put on face-to-face interactions versus telephone or online stuff,
Right.
Online learning. So we've done stories around that, like how do you do education in an age of COVID-19 when there are some students who don't have high-speed internet and who culturally are sort of oriented to learning face-to-face in classrooms with people. And I'm sure that is true of students who are not Native American. But if you look at the history of Native Americans in New Mexico and writ large across the nation, a lot of them live in geographically isolated places. They don't have access to medical help. They have to, because of laws throughout our history, they might have to travel with their family 30 miles to get groceries, maybe farther. And so, it's those kinds of things that we're focusing on, we're paying attention to, because I think there are journalists who are focusing on that. But I'm not sure they're focusing necessarily on the learning part, like how are schools adapting. I would say that I don't know that we're going to stop focusing on prison population and seeing, how there are many reasons for that. First off, there is this kind of moral kind of recognition that everybody's human. That's just my moral stance. People can take me on if they want to. I did go to seminary, so I can go with you on philosophy and theology if you'd like. I'm just putting that out for some of your listeners or your viewers. But also because, look, in addition to a moral kind of position that we're all human beings deserving of dignity, I think that prisons also, what happens there can affect the outside world. Because COs come in and out,
Yeah. After we did, during that episode last week on prisons, I got chills a couple of times, just really, taking it in, like what it would mean to be in prison during this time, to not see visitors, to be, so anxious about health. And these are all fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, uncles, aunts. So
Right.
So I understand the focus on that. So Trip, before we wind up this discussion, is there anything that
Wind up? I thought it's only 5 minutes.
I know we're just getting
We're just start. You just start getting me going now. Okay, now I'm just joking.
No, seriously, we have more time.
No. I'm just joking with you.
Where else do you want to go? I mean, I have a thought about you sort of turning the tables here and saying, what do we as consumers of journalism need to do that's ethical right now during this pandemic? And we touched on that a little bit, but happy to entertain anything that you want to talk about before we sign off.
Well, I mean, I was joking about continuing this for 3 or 4 hours, which I could do. But I do think that it is not just the responsibility of journalists to they're not the only part of the equation in an informed citizenry. Mm-hmm. An informed citizenry people need to understand their own responsibilities, which is what we were talking about before, which is critically thinking. checking making sure that you're not doing the confirmation bias thing, which is, oh, I agree with this. And look, that's hard for anybody sometimes, if it is something we believe and hold dearly. I get that. But I think another thing is, and this is part of the reason I have my Facebook page the way I do, which is I have people from we have 300 comments on some things. Part of it is, I think what I've learned over the years is, if I know someone personally who believes differently, but I know them and they're human beings and I like them and I care about them, then suddenly they cease to be an object.
Mhm.
And the line that they're giving me in an issue, I can maybe, as a reporter, I have to do this, but as a person, I can try to understand where it's coming from. Because I know them to be a good, genuine person. And there are so many, I believe this, there are so many good, genuine people in the United States. Social media will tell us otherwise. The political debate will tell us otherwise. But I know so many people who are, Trump supporters, Biden supporters, people who supported Hillary, all over the political spectrum. And in the end, they have their own lives. And I'm not sure we can always make sense of it, but we always can remember that they're human beings.
When you are working on a story, when you're reporting, does that sort of outlook on life inform your work?
To be honest, I have to say, I don't think I can stop it from informing, because I have been in situations where I had to report on a governor who went to federal prison because he broke the law. And I actually knew him as a person. And I remember talking to him one night, several months after he was convicted. He was waiting to be sentenced. And he called up and he was broken. And I'll never forget that. As much as I think he deserved his time in prison. He went back to prison years later for another crime he did. But at some point, I was moved on a human level, and I try to keep that. I try to remember that. I think sometimes it is difficult if you're in the middle. This is not COVID-19 stuff. This is like, if you're in the middle of a scandal and there's a feeding frenzy and there's a lot of pushback from a public official, it is hard to remember that sometimes. And I try to keep that close.
Well, in fact, just remembering what I read in the SPJ's Code of Ethics, that's part of the code. Really says, be in short, continue to be human, and understand that. And even when you're pushing, if you're don't do unnecessary harm. You're.
Yeah, and in some ways, I will say that it's like a lot of things. Journalism isn't easy in those moments. You have to really take stock. And I think people need to remember that too, is, journalists are human beings too, as well.
Yeah.
Many of us do not work in Washington on cable TV news and debate stuff. Most of us cover legislatures or city councils or school boards. I would say that too needs to be kind of like recognized among a lot of people. Consumers, that journalists, the vast majority of journalists don't get to make appearances on, the big TV programs in Washington or New York.
Right. One thing I'm learning, Trip, from these episodes is that they're having these discussions ahead of a crisis time, whether it's for a journalist, whether it's for a medical ethicist, whether it's for a consumer of medical care who might have to advise on how they want their relative treated who might have COVID-19, whether it's a restaurant owner, getting these things out ahead of time, having these discussions bears fruit. It gives people an opportunity to look inside, to realize what their ideals and values are, and to act accordingly.
Right. That's correct.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, I don't mean to get too philosophical, but that helps you be aware, like you said, of who you are. and what your values are. And sometimes in the middle of a crisis like this, it's hard sometimes to remember that stuff. If you've not done some of that, I guess, work.
Yeah. And maybe it'll help you reach for your best self rather than
Right.
your lesser self in that moment. Well,
Right.
anything else that you want to you want to ruminate on, Trip, before we say
Oh, I could ruminate on all sorts of stuff for the rest of the day. You know that, Kathleen.
goodbye?
No, I'm fine. No, thank
No, I
you.
do, and I appreciate that about you, and I hope we'll get a chance to chat again, and continue your good work. I want to remind people that they can reach your publication at nmindepth.com. I want to say thanks to our guest, Trip Jennings, for joining us. You can connect to every Ethics Now episode on www.ethicsnow.org or on all major podcast platforms. Visit our Ethics Watch Facebook page to suggest topics or guests, or email us at ethicsnowshow@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and see you next time on Ethics Now. Be well, Trip. Be well,
Thanks
all.
for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.